What do Michelangelo, King Philip II of Spain, and Flemish painter Anthony van Dyck all have in common? They all got to meet the Italian Renaissance master Sofonisba Anguissola. Sofonisba Anguissola was born in 1532 to mother Bianca Ponzone and father Amilcare Anguissola. She was the oldest of 7 children, which included 5 sisters and 1 brother. As the daughter of nobility, Anguissola was well educated by the standards of the day. That may have been good enough for most fathers in the 16th century, but Amilcare was ambitious. I've read a couple of different interpretations of his intent. One source claims that he wanted to ensure not just Anguissola, but all of his daughters were able to live as independently as possible within the societal constraints of the time. A different source explains that it's likely he made sure their education was so thorough in order to make them into appealing marriage prospects. Women were expected to become wives and then mothers in 16th century Europe, and well-educated women were more appealing companions to men than ignorant ones. In 1545, Amilcare arranged an apprenticeship for Sofonisba and her sister Elena with Italian artist Bernardino Campi. It was unheard of in this era for a woman to apprentice, as such an arrangement typically meant the student went to live with the instructor. Nevertheless, apprentice they did, and Anguissola's natural talent was soon enhanced by the formal instruction, and her skills quickly outmatched her teachers. One of Anguissola's self-portraits is this rather clever composition of her first teacher, Bernardino Campi, standing at the easel and painting a larger-than-life Sofonisba. In this painting, Anguissola has painted her own features in Campi's style while detailing the face of her instructor in her own. The contrast between the two styles is pretty sharp. The painted Anguissola's features are neat, even, and almost doll-like. The face of Campi is very lifelike and lacks the careful stylization of Anguissola's. The ghost of Anguissola's left hand can be seen reaching up to meet her tutors. As the painting is clearly still in process given Campi's pose, this ghost arm can be read in 2 ways. Firstly, it's likely that the artist has changed his mind about the composition and adjusted it mid-painting. The second reading is possibly Anguissola's way of subtly indicating the true painter of this double portrait. Her hand is reaching through the surface of the canvas to guide his as he paints her. When she was 22 in 1554, Anguissola traveled to Rome and was introduced by some means or another to Michelangelo. The story goes, the great master was impressed by a drawing she had done of a young, laughing girl, a portrait of one of her sisters and an older woman, likely a governess. He challenged her to draw a crying boy, which was a subject he considered to be more difficult. Anguissola easily produced the requested drawing. Like many of her early works, this sketch is made up of family members and shows her youngest sister, Minerva, as she comforts their young brother, Asdrubale. As an aside, it is thought likely that this drawing was the inspiration for Caravaggio's Boy Bitten by a Lizard, painted at the end of the century in 1595. Michelangelo was again so impressed by her skill, he proceeded to informally tutor her over the next 2 or 3 years via correspondence. He would send her drawings to copy and then offer her advice and critique on the results. Not only was this valuable instruction to Anguissola, it also likely added to her fame in the Italian artistic circles. The game of chess, painted in 1555 when she was 23, is probably one of Anguissola's most famous works. Anguissola painted 3 of her younger sisters, along with a housemaid, enjoying a game of chess in the garden. Lucia, the eldest of the 3 in the scene, is depicted delightedly claiming victory over Minerva, who yields her defeat with a resigned expression. Europa looks on gleefully, while the housemaid quietly observes. The depiction of an informal scene and facial expressions combined with the formal clothing was unusual for Italian art in this time period. Anguissola's skill is displayed to great effect in this simple domestic scene. She has captured the visages of 4 women in different stages of life, each with her own unique expression. The landscape and the tree in the background show off her ability to render plant life. She has angled the chessboard in such a way that it almost juts out into the viewer's space. By painting her sisters engaged in a game of chess, she has also removed them from their usual feminine sphere of domestic pursuits, such as embroidery or weaving. The rich clothing she has chosen for her sisters is a callback to those occupations, but the focus is on the intellectual stimulation of the game. It was considered improper for women to play dice or cards during the Renaissance, as those games relied on luck, but a game of skill, such as chess, was an acceptable activity for ladies. Anguissola may have been looking to emphasize the intelligence of her sisters during a period in history when intellect and strategy were considered part of the male domain. Anguissola painted this self-portrait in 1556, the year she turned 26. It's oil on canvas and 66 centimeters by 57 centimeters, or roughly 26 inches by 22.5 inches. Since that's kind of a weird aspect ratio, I trimmed the right edge down for my master study to get a better fit on my watercolor block. During my research, I read that Anguissola was dissatisfied with her societally mandated place as a woman, which at the time more or less required her to be a passive object. I don't know if there is hard evidence for this claim or if it's simply inferred from the way she painted her self-portraits. If it is simply inferred, I can see why this was the interpretation, especially with this one. Rather than paint the sort of portrait that was commonplace at the time with a stiffly sitting subject, Anguissola depicted herself at the easel, brush in hand. Like many of her early works, she used this self-portrait as an opportunity to showcase not only her skill at portraiture, but also her ability to depict religious iconography. By setting up her self-portrait in this manner, she connected herself to her work in a more concrete way than a signature would have allowed. Her face is irrevocably associated with this scene of the Madonna and Christ Child. In that same vein, religious painting as a genre was typically closed off to women, as successfully drafting complex compositions of many individuals required a detailed study of anatomy, and it was considered improper for women to view nude models for the purposes of such study. Anguissola didn't let this stop her from exploring what she could of the genre. Although most of her religious paintings have been lost, a few have survived, and there are records that more existed once upon a time. A combination of Amilcare's persistence in promoting his daughter and Anguissola's unquestionable skill gained her some fame in not only northern Italy, but in surrounding countries. All of her father's hopes for his daughter came to fruition in 1559, when King Philip II of Spain invited Anguissola to come to his court as the lady-in-waiting of his young queen, Elizabeth of Valois. Elizabeth was Philip's third wife, and she was only 14 years old when Anguissola came to wait on her in 1559. At 27, Anguissola was nearly twice the queen's age, but she was a grown woman with 5 younger sisters, so Elizabeth was in excellent company. In fact, based on what I've been reading, it sounds like the two became good friends. While living in the Spanish court, Anguissola's artistic renderings shifted away from the creative, playful style of her youth in order to meet the requirements of high society. She adopted the more sedate, rigid style that was expected of painters of nobility. Even constrained by the requirements of formal portraiture, her personal style continued to show through. Art teachers during her lifetime used Anguissola's works as instructional material, requiring students to create master copies of her portraits. This no doubt spread her fame even further, and was likely one of the many reasons that painters of all ages would approach her for instruction throughout her long life. Anguissola's life was upended with the sudden death of the young queen. Elizabeth of Valois died from complications following a miscarriage in 1568 when she was only 23. Philip's attachment to Elizabeth was so great that he took prodigious care of her friend and teacher Anguissola. He arranged her marriage to a Sicilian nobleman, Fabrizio Moncada Pignatelli, and provided her dowry. He also provided her with a pension, which allowed her to continue painting and teaching. Anguissola married Fabrizio in 1571, the year she turned 39. While marriage quite often signaled the end of a woman's time making paintings, Anguissola was, thankfully, an exception to that rule. Some sources say the couple moved to Fabrizio's hometown of Paterno in southern Italy, but others suggest they remained in Spain. In either case, there isn't a whole lot to talk about regarding this union. Fabrizio was reportedly supportive of Anguissola's painting, the couple had no children, and he died of unknown causes 8 years after their marriage in 1579. 2 years later, Anguissola was traveling to Cremona by ship, likely returning to her family's home in northern Italy. During the voyage, she met and fell in love with the ship's captain, Orazio Lomellino. A ship's captain was a serious downgrade from the son of a prince, and that's probably why Anguissola's brother objected quite strongly to her marrying Orazio. Or it could have been the age gap. As far as I can tell, Anguissola was roughly 15 years older than Orazio. I have no idea if unions where the wife is significantly older than the husband was a big deal or not at the time, but it's an interesting little nugget, so I wanted to mention it. However, brother Asdrubale was overruled by King Philip of Spain. Philip came in clutch for Anguissola with his blessing and another generous dowry. Anguissola and Orazio married in December of 1584 when she was 52. The couple lived in Genoa, where Anguissola acted as the king's agent and recommended art and artists for his new palace at El Escorial. When she was 83, in 1615, Anguissola and Orazio moved to Palermo, where he did most of his business. She continued to instruct young artists who sought her advice. Her generous pension from King Philip, as well as her second husband's not insignificant fortune, allowed her the freedom to teach as she chose. Sofonisba Anguissola was an unusual and innovative artist in many ways during her lifetime. While it wasn't unheard of for an artist to paint their own self-portrait, it also wasn't incredibly common. Anguissola painted many self-portraits over her lifetime, and this was her last, painted in 1620, the year she turned 88. What really draws me to this portrait is Anguissola didn't shy away from depicting the effects of aging, although she easily could have. She could also just as easily not have made the painting altogether, but she did it anyway. If Anguissola really was dissatisfied with the role and limitations placed on her by society because of her gender, this final self-portrait could be interpreted as an act of defiance. Here she sits, a woman of education, wit, and intelligence. Her skills, honed over a lifetime, are on display with each brushstroke. She holds in her hands a book and a letter signaling her interest in writing and intellectual pursuits. She is no longer young, but that doesn't matter, as youth is not an indicator of a woman's worth. Sofonisba Anguissola gave up painting in her final years as her eyesight failed. Although she could no longer paint, she could still offer advice, and she was generous as always with her time when young artists sought her out. At age 92, in 1624, Anguissola was visited by the young Flemish painter Anthony van Dyck. He would go on to become one of the highest-paid portrait artists of the 17th century and the leading court painter in England. According to Van Dyck's written account of the meeting, the two spoke for hours. He drew her portrait, and she gave him some excellent art advice. He described her as mentally alert and noted that her eyesight had declined. Van Dyck later claimed that this conversation with Anguissola taught him more about painting than anything else in his life. Van Dyck's portrait of Anguissola, the last one made during her lifetime, is displayed in Knoll in England. Sofonisba Anguissola died at the age of 93 in 1625. Orazio buried her in Palermo at the church of St. George of the Genoese. It's fairly clear Orazio adored Anguissola. 7 years after her death, on the anniversary of her 100th birthday, he placed an inscription on her tomb. To Sofonisba, my wife, who is recorded among the illustrious women of the world, outstanding in portraying the images of men. Orazio Lomellino, in sorrow for the loss of his great love in 1632, dedicated this little tribute to such a great woman. Sofonisba Anguissola's success as a woman painter in 16th and 17th century Europe is considered to be the turning point in a society that was very reluctant to allow women to aspire to anything besides motherhood. It is thought that Anguissola's very public and well-known success in the Spanish court was part of what motivated Lavinia Fontana and Artemisia Gentileschi into their successful careers. In addition to that, her paintings were so successful that they were used to instruct students, the vast majority of whom were male. Her stylistic influence spread across Europe even during her lifetime and had a significant impact on the Western art canon in the following centuries. And time for some self-critique. I'm still on the upward slope, feeling even more positive about the results of each new painting than the last. I finished this to my satisfaction in 2 sittings, totaling about 4 hours. I feel like I'm finally getting a better grip on contrast as well as painting faces. Again, I still haven't managed to recreate an exact likeness, but this one is a lot closer than my past attempts, so I know I'm on the right track. I'm excited to keep practicing and learning. And speaking of learning, I've been putting her off for a while now. I wanted to get a feel for making these kinds of videos before attempting to talk about probably one of the best-known Italian Baroque painters, Artemisia Gentileschi. I'm finally in a place where I feel confident tackling this particular biography, so check back in a couple of weeks for my Gentileschi master study. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you again.